For years, the doors barely opened, and some men forgot what unscripted conversations sounded like. By the time transfers finally came, many no longer recognized themselves. Those men had been housed in the security housing unit at Pelican Bay State Prison in Crescent City, California, a facility that became synonymous with prolonged solitary confinement beginning in 1989. Pelican Bay was built during an era of rising prison violence, designed to isolate individuals identified as serious security threats, particularly those validated as members of prison gangs. Inside the SHU, inmates were typically confined to windowless concrete cells for at least 22.5 hours a day, sometimes for years without a fixed release date. Natural light was limited to a small skylight above an enclosed exercise yard, where prisoners spent brief periods alone in what many described as concrete pens. Human contact was tightly controlled. Meals came through slots. Conversations with staff were minimal. Visits, when allowed, were conducted behind thick glass with monitored phone receivers. For some, the isolation lasted not months but decades, often tied to gang validation policies that required inmates to debrief or provide information before release from the unit. Debriefing carried its own risks, creating a system where some men faced an indefinite choice between isolation or potential retaliation if labeled informants. If stories like this matter to you, subscribing helps us keep examining how policies like these shaped real lives inside American prisons. Over time, researchers and legal advocates began documenting what extended isolation appeared to do to the human mind, raising questions that prison officials could not easily dismiss. Psychologists have long understood that humans are social beings, and prolonged deprivation of meaningful interaction can alter cognition, mood, and perception. In the SHU, many inmates reported chronic anxiety, difficulty concentrating, hypersensitivity to sound, and disrupted sleep patterns that intensified the longer confinement continued. Some described losing track of time entirely, measuring days only by meal deliveries or the distant echo of metal doors opening and closing along the tier. Legal filings in multiple cases alleged that individuals began talking to themselves for hours, not out of theatrics, but as a way to simulate human interaction. Court records also referenced self-harm incidents and mental health deterioration, though prison officials maintained that safety protocols were in place to monitor vulnerable inmates. Yet critics argued that the very design of the unit amplified psychological strain, particularly for those already struggling with pre-existing mental health conditions. In 1995, a federal class action lawsuit known as Madrid versus Gomez challenged conditions inside Pelican Bay's SHU, focusing in part on the treatment of mentally ill prisoners. The court ultimately ruled that placing seriously mentally ill inmates in the SHU constituted cruel and unusual punishment, requiring reforms for that specific population. However, the broader system of long-term isolation for others remained intact, and many prisoners continued serving indeterminate terms in near-total segregation. For men who entered the SHU in their 20s, birthdays passed in the same concrete room, with no physical contact from family and no communal programs. Letters became lifelines. Some inmates wrote daily, filling notebooks with reflections, legal research, or simply reminders that language still belonged to them. But literacy did not protect against the slow erosion of social skills, a problem that surfaced when a few were eventually transferred to general population units. Correctional staff reported that some long-term SHU prisoners struggled with routine interactions, avoiding eye contact or becoming overwhelmed in environments with noise and movement. Former inmates later testified that ordinary experiences, such as standing in a crowded chow hall, could trigger panic after years spent alone in silent cells. What troubled advocates most was not a single symptom, but the cumulative effect of years without meaningful human connection. Medical experts submitted declarations explaining that extended solitary confinement could increase risks of depression, paranoia, and cognitive decline, especially over decades. Still, prison administrators defended the SHU as a necessary tool to control gang influence that they believed threatened safety across California's prison system. The tension between security and human cost simmered for years, largely out of public view, until a new wave of protests forced attention back inside. In 2011, inmates at Pelican Bay initiated a hunger strike, protesting conditions and the indefinite nature of gang validation policies. The strike expanded beyond Pelican Bay, drawing participation from thousands of prisoners across California and prompting renewed scrutiny from lawmakers and civil rights groups. As weeks passed, the physical toll on participants became evident, and officials faced mounting pressure to address long-standing grievances. But the hunger strike revealed something else. Even after decades in isolation, inmates were still capable of coordinated collective action. That fact surprised observers who assumed prolonged segregation would permanently fracture any sense of solidarity. It also raised an uncomfortable question about what resilience meant in an environment specifically designed to suppress it. Behind each protest statistic were individuals who had spent 10, 15, even 20 years in the SHU without committing a new violent act. Some had been validated based on possession of certain artwork, coded writings, or association evidence, rather than direct disciplinary violations. Critics argued that such standards made exit from isolation nearly impossible, effectively transforming temporary segregation into open-ended confinement. Meanwhile, families described the emotional strain of maintaining relationships through glass partitions and monitored phone calls that rarely lasted more than a few hours. Children grew up visiting fathers they could not touch, learning to speak through receivers that sometimes crackled with static. For inmates released directly from the SHU to parole, re-entry into society posed another layer of difficulty. Adjusting to open spaces, crowded streets, and constant stimulation required rapid adaptation after years spent in near-sensory deprivation. Some former prisoners later explained that they felt more comfortable alone than in public, a reversal of the social instincts most people take for granted. Others struggled with trust, describing how prolonged surveillance and restricted communication altered how they interpreted everyday interactions. Yet the long-term data on outcomes remained incomplete, partly because many individuals cycled back into custody for parole violations or unrelated offenses. What was clear, however, was that Pelican Bay's model of extended isolation had become a national reference point. Lawmakers, courts, and corrections officials across the United States cited it when debating the limits of solitary confinement. By the early 2010s, mounting legal challenges and public pressure began reshaping California's policies in measurable ways. But before reforms took hold, an entire generation of inmates had already spent significant portions of their adult lives in concrete cells. The question was no longer whether isolation changed them, but how much of that change could ever be undone. Time inside the SHU did not move in seasons or milestones, but in repetition, measured by identical days that rarely differed from the last. That repetition reshaped perception, compressing years into a blur while simultaneously stretching individual hours into something almost unmanageable. Several former inmates later described how memory itself felt altered, with certain years difficult to recall and others remembered only through fragments of routine. Experts who studied long-term segregation noted that monotony can distort cognitive processing, reducing stimulation to a level that challenges attention and emotional regulation. In court testimony and academic research, psychologists explained that environmental deprivation affects not only mood, but executive functioning and impulse control. For inmates already serving lengthy sentences, the added layer of isolation often meant confronting two separate forms of confinement at once. One was the sentence imposed by the court. The other was administrative segregation, sometimes indefinite, layered on top without a fixed endpoint. That uncertainty, according to multiple declarations submitted in litigation, intensified stress beyond the physical limits of the cell. Without a defined release date from the SHU, some prisoners reported feeling suspended in a system where compliance did not guarantee progress. Officials defended the review process as necessary to manage validated gang members, emphasizing that security concerns extended beyond individual disciplinary records. But critics argued that validation criteria sometimes relied on confidential sources inmates could not meaningfully challenge. This created a perception, documented in legal filings, that some men were trapped by information they could neither confirm nor refute. The psychological impact of perceived powerlessness became a recurring theme in expert assessments of long-term SHU prisoners. Researchers found that when individuals believe they have little control over outcomes, symptoms of depression and learned helplessness may increase. Inside Pelican Bay, that dynamic unfolded over years, not weeks. amplifying its potential consequences. Mental health services were available, but delivery within a high-security segregation unit was constrained by the same architectural limitations. Therapy sessions, when provided, often occurred at cell fronts or through secure barriers, limiting the nuance of face-to-face interaction. Advocates argued that meaningful treatment is difficult to deliver in a setting designed primarily for containment rather than rehabilitation. Meanwhile, correctional staff faced their own challenges managing a population housed under extreme restrictions. Officers worked in a highly controlled environment where routine was rigid, and interpersonal contact with inmates remained limited. The structure reduced certain types of conflict but created a culture defined by separation and constant surveillance. For inmates who entered the SHU in early adulthood, prolonged isolation intersected with critical developmental years. Research in neuroscience indicates that social interaction plays a key role in emotional regulation and cognitive maturation. Extended deprivation during those periods may shape long-term behavioral patterns, though precise outcomes vary by individual. Some prisoners used correspondence courses and self-study to maintain intellectual engagement, completing degrees through distance education programs when permitted. Others focused on physical conditioning within the narrow confines of their cells, establishing strict regimens to structure time. Yet even disciplined routines could not fully offset the absence of spontaneous human exchange. When reforms following the Ashker settlement reduced the number of inmates held in indeterminate SHU terms, transitions exposed the depth of institutional conditioning. Men who had spent more than a decade in isolation often described heightened sensitivity to noise and crowd density. Ordinary prison sounds, such as overlapping conversations or movement in common areas, required gradual acclimation. Staff supervising step-down programs reported that some participants initially withdrew rather than engage in group settings. These reactions were not uniform, but they were common enough to draw attention from mental health professionals monitoring reintegration. Outside the prison walls, policymakers began examining whether similar long-term segregation practices existed in other jurisdictions. Pelican Bay's experience influenced broader discussions about time limits on solitary confinement and the screening of vulnerable populations. Federal courts increasingly scrutinized whether extended isolation violated constitutional protections, particularly when applied to mentally ill inmates. Still, debate persisted over how to balance institutional security with documented psychological risks. For those who had already endured decades in segregation, policy shifts arrived late. The cumulative effect of isolation had already shaped habits, coping mechanisms, and perceptions of safety. Some former SHU inmates described relearning basic social cues, including how to interpret tone and facial expression. Others struggled with decision-making in environments offering more autonomy than they had experienced in years. Reentry organizations noted that prolonged isolation compounded existing barriers to employment, housing, and social stability. The consequences extended beyond individual adjustment, influencing families and communities connected to those released. Children who had grown up visiting through glass encountered parents adjusting to new emotional rhythms. Spouses and relatives described relationships that required rebuilding after years defined by physical separation. Public awareness of these long-term effects gradually expanded as investigative reports and legislative hearings highlighted personal accounts. Pelican Bay's SHU became a symbol in national debates, cited by both critics of solitary confinement and defenders of strict prison control. What remained undeniable was the scale of time involved. Some men had entered isolation before the widespread use of the internet and left it in a society transformed by digital communication. Their confinement did not simply remove them from the public. It paused their exposure to social evolution. As reforms reduced reliance on indeterminate SHU placement, California corrections officials emphasized alternative management strategies. Yet the question persisted about what decades in isolation had already done. For many former inmates, the effects were not limited to memory of confinement. They were embedded in patterns of thought, stress response, and interpersonal distance that followed them long after the steel doors opened. For some former SHU inmates, the first night outside isolation was not defined by relief, but by restlessness that sleep could not resolve. Silence had once been imposed. Now ordinary noise felt intrusive, and the absence of rigid routine created unexpected unease. Mental health professionals observing transitions noted that adjustment often unfolded in stages rather than immediate transformation. Initial exposure to group housing could trigger anxiety, followed by gradual adaptation as predictable patterns reemerged. However, adaptation did not erase years of conditioned behavior developed inside concrete walls. Individuals accustomed to constant surveillance sometimes continued scanning rooms for threats long after policy restrictions eased. Hypervigilance, once a survival response, became difficult to disengage from in less restrictive environments. Researchers studying long-term solitary confinement have emphasized that the human stress response is not easily recalibrated after prolonged activation. When stress systems remain heightened for years, even neutral situations can feel destabilizing. Former inmates described struggling to interpret tone or intent during ordinary conversations. Misunderstandings occasionally escalated into disciplinary issues, reinforcing how isolation's legacy could shape future interactions. Correctional administrators acknowledged that reintegration required structured support, including counseling and gradual exposure to social settings. Step-down programs attempted to reintroduce privileges incrementally, balancing security concerns with adjustment needs. Yet resources varied, and outcomes were not uniform across all participants. Some individuals demonstrated resilience, leveraging education and routine to rebuild social confidence. Others required sustained mental health intervention to manage anxiety, depression, or distrust cultivated during isolation. Outside observers often framed solitary confinement as either necessary control or unacceptable punishment. For those who lived through it, the experience was less abstract and more cumulative. Years in the SHU did not produce a single predictable outcome, but patterns emerged across testimonies and research. Extended isolation was associated with higher rates of reported psychological distress compared to general prison populations. Studies cited in litigation and legislative hearings linked prolonged segregation to increased risk of self-harm and suicidal ideation. These findings contributed to policy debates extending beyond California. States across the country reviewed their use of supermax housing, examining duration limits and mental health screening practices. Federal oversight bodies also began evaluating segregation policies within national correctional systems. Pelican Bay's history became part of a broader national reckoning about how isolation functions within modern incarceration. Reforms implemented in California reduced the population housed in indeterminate SHU confinement significantly after 2015. Many inmates previously held for years were transferred to general population units or alternative programs. The numbers shifted, but the personal histories remained. Men who had spent decades in isolation carried that experience into every subsequent stage of confinement or release. Community reentry specialists reported that rebuilding trust was often one of the most difficult tasks. Trust in institutions had eroded for some, shaped by years of perceived unpredictability in review processes. Trust in others required relearning cues that had faded during long periods without direct contact. Employment training programs noted that prolonged isolation sometimes limited collaborative skills valued in workplace settings. Family members described cautious optimism mixed with uncertainty during reunification. Relationships formed through letters and monitored visits required renegotiation once physical proximity returned. In public discourse, solitary confinement increasingly faced scrutiny as awareness of its long-term consequences expanded. Advocacy groups pointed to Pelican Bay as evidence that indefinite isolation could persist for decades without clear endpoints. Corrections officials maintained that reforms demonstrated adaptability within the system. Both positions acknowledged a shared reality. Decades in isolation left measurable effects. Those effects were not confined to psychological assessments or court transcripts. They appeared in posture, in speech cadence, in the careful distance some former inmates maintained even among supportive relatives. Time spent alone had reshaped how many experienced space and interaction. The SHU at Pelican Bay no longer houses the same number of long-term segregated inmates it once did. Policy shifts altered its function, reflecting broader changes in correctional philosophy. Yet the legacy of earlier decades continues to inform debates about punishment, safety, and human limits. For the men who endured extended isolation, the experience cannot be reduced to statistics alone. It represents years measured in silence, adaptation, and survival within a system built for containment. Understanding what decades in isolation did to Pelican Bay inmates requires acknowledging both institutional intent and human consequence. The architecture of control achieved certain security objectives. At the same time, it revealed how profoundly environment can shape cognition, behavior, and identity over time. As policymakers continue to reconsider the boundaries of solitary confinement, Pelican Bay remains a case study with enduring relevance. Its history demonstrates that isolation is not a temporary condition when measured in decades. It becomes an environment capable of altering how individuals perceive themselves and the world around them. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.